Hello. Oh, sorry about that. There's a bit of an echo. Okay, that seems better. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Stacy Gomez, and I'm a member of Known as Legal Halifax, Chibouctouc, which is a migrant support organization. And we provide support and are engaged in solidarity with migrant workers throughout Nova Scotia through our Migrant Workers Program. We have a regular webinar series where we are inviting guest speakers to speak with you about a number of topics that are of interest that you have shared that you would like to learn more about. And so I'm happy to be joined tonight by Rachel Barbour with the Office of the Worker Counsellor for this webinar on workers' compensation, the Workers' Compensation Board of Nova Scotia, and what to do if you are injured on the job, what benefits you may be able to receive through workers' compensation, what that process looks like. So I'm sure that there are people that are maybe still coming on to see this webinar. So welcome everyone. Before I pass it over, I will just share that as usual, you can send your questions to us by WhatsApp. So our number is 902-329-9595. You can send us questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have a question and answer section with Rachel, and we'll share your questions in an anonymous way, so we won't share your name. Feel free to send us questions. With that, I think I'm going to Rachel, I can share a brief bio if that's helpful.
If you'd like to, I can always give you. I can provide a bio too. Whatever works.
Okay,
Stacey.
Perfect. So maybe I'll just pass it on to you then.
You bet. All right. Thank you so much, Stacy, and Tabasa, who's in the background providing tech support and helping me through this. My name is Rachel Barbour. I work for an organization called the Office of the Worker Counsellor. And my background is working in occupational health and safety and the workers' compensation systems across Canada. And I'm here today to provide some information about how workers' compensation works here in Nova Scotia, which will tell you a lot about how it works in other parts of Canada as well, because it's all very similar. And I'm here to talk to you about what happens if you get injured at work, what you should expect, and how you can make sure that you're being treated fairly if you've been injured at work. I have a slideshow that I'm going to share right now, and we will go through that. Usually it takes about 45 minutes to an hour. Hopefully it'll be interesting for you. And once we've done that, we'll have a chance to take questions and answer them through Stacy. We'll take it from here. So here comes the slideshow. I'm going to have to back it up a little bit. Bear with me, because apparently I started it earlier. Sorry about that. Okay. So again, today we're going to be talking about workers' compensation and how to navigate your way through the workers' compensation system here in Nova Scotia. I work for the Office of the Worker Counsellor, and we provide assistance, advocacy, and education in the subjects of workers' compensation or occupational health and safety Our services are free and confidential. And at the end, I'm going to make sure that you've got our contact information. So if at any point you've got questions or you run into problems or issues, you'll know how to reach our organization. Again, it's free and confidential, and we're starting to learn about some of the special needs of the migrant worker community, and we've been working closely with Stacey, and no one is illegal. So certainly we're an asset, or we're a resource for migrant workers here in Nova Scotia, and we want to make sure that we're here to provide you with the assistance that you need as well. So that's who I am, and that's who I work for. I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to talk about over the next hour or so. I'm going to talk about the workers' compensation system. We'll do a little bit of a history of workers' compensation and why it exists. If any of you did have an opportunity to participate a few weeks back in the session we did together on occupational health and safety, you'll know we pretty much always start with a history lesson. Then we'll talk about the structure of the Workers' Compensation Board and the workers' compensation system here in Nova Scotia, how it's set up and how it works. We'll talk about workers' compensation claims and the benefits that injured workers are entitled to in the event they're injured at work. We'll talk about duties, both of the employer and of you, the worker, your responsibilities if you've got a workplace injury, and your employer's responsibilities. And then we'll get to the section on questions. So let's jump into things. So we're going to talk first about the history and structure, but we can't really go anywhere until we know what WCB is. And WCB stands for Workers' Compensation Board. In Canada, workers' compensation, or WCB, is how workers are compensated in the event of an injury at work. It's a special system that has been established in every jurisdiction across Canada, whether it's a province or a territory. And it essentially takes the place of courts of law in determining what compensation or benefits people are entitled to if they're injured at work. We're going to highlight a few important things that you should know as a migrant worker here in Nova Scotia throughout the course of this presentation. One of the things that you should know and remember is the moment you start working in Canada, you are covered by the Workers' Compensation Board. So in the event of a workplace injury, you are entitled to assistance from workers' compensation. It doesn't matter how long you've been here. There's no waiting period or delay. If you're hurt at work, you're entitled to coverage. And we'll talk a lot more about what that means. So we'll talk a bit about the history now. Before workers' compensation was started in Canada, there were a lot of issues with people being injured or killed at work. Workers were subjected to low wages and very dangerous work conditions. Injuries were happening all of the time, very, very severe and serious injuries. Technically, a worker or their family could sue an employer. But in practice, it was very, very expensive for workers to go up in the courts against their employers, and very, very few of them were successful if they tried to sue their employer. This started causing a lot of difficulty because workers were being severely injured or killed on the job, and they were being left with no assistance or compensation at all. In very rare cases, however, injured workers or their families would sue the employer, and the resulting settlement would put the employer out of business. So in the rare circumstances where workers were successful in suing their employer, the consequences of that lawsuit put the employer out of business and all of the other employees in that workplace out of work. So really, the system wasn't working for anyone. It wasn't working for the workers and employees out there. And it really wasn't working for employers because they were taking so much risk of if they were being sued by their employees. The problem was, of course, that these employers had what was called an unholy, it's sort of a catchphrase. The employers had an unholy trinity of legal defenses. So if someone was injured at work, the employer could go to court and could argue that it wasn't their responsibility, that it wasn't their fault, and they didn't have to provide compensation for that workplace injury. And this unholy trinity of legal defenses included contributory negligence. So if a worker contributed in any way at all to their own injury, if perhaps they were careless or cutting corners in the workplace, an employer could argue contributory negligence, and the worker would lose their lawsuit. They would not be entitled to any compensation. There was the fellow servant rule. And the fellow servant rule meant if any coworker in the workplace contributed to the accident, then the injured party would not receive any assistance or compensation. So the employer, again, would be off the hook, and they wouldn't have to compensate the person who was injured because really it was a coworker or another employee who had caused that accident. And then there was the voluntary assumption of risk. So when employers were sued in the past, again, this is historical, they would argue that when the worker accepted the job, they also accepted the risks associated with the job. And often the voluntary assumption of risk was a very good legal defense because many of us in the workplace, even today, figure, our jobs might be dangerous, but that's just the way it is. So using those three legal defenses in court saved employers from having to compensate workers who had been injured or the families of workers who had been killed. Again, that meant that injured workers or surviving families received little to no compensation. They were rarely successful in getting anything out of a lawsuit, even if they could get to the point of filing a lawsuit. But in the rare circumstances where those legal defenses did not protect the employer, then there were large settlements going to these parties and the employers were going out of business. So it was considered, again, a system that wasn't working for anybody, workers or employers. So they decided to change the system. And way back in the early 1900s, they hired this guy, Sir William Meredith, to travel across the world and figure out how other countries were compensating people for workplace injuries. Sir William Meredith came back after a few years and said, look, there are 5 principles to a fair and just and sustainable workers' compensation scheme. Those principles are, number 1, no fault compensation. And that means essentially that it doesn't matter who caused the injury. It doesn't matter whose fault the injury was. It doesn't matter if the worker contributed to their own injury or if a coworker contributed to it or if it was an act of God. a worker would be entitled to compensation for an injury regardless of who or what was at fault. So that was his first principle. Security of benefits just meant that, workers should not lose the right to compensation because the employer went out of business or decided to run and hide. The benefits needed to be secure for workers regardless of what happened to the employer. And yeah, that's security of benefits. Meredith also believed that such a system needed to be employer funded. So it's not funded by taxpayers. It's not funded by contributions from workers. It is entirely funded by employers, and that employers should share the liability. So in the event of a catastrophic injury, the liability or the responsibility for those injuries should be shared among all employers, and it shouldn't put one employer out of business. Independent administration was another principle, and Meredith felt that, really we shouldn't have employers in charge of this compensation scheme, and we shouldn't really have the government in charge of this compensation scheme. It shouldn't be a private company. It should be an independent system that administers the workers' compensation scheme. And lastly, the last Meredith principle is perhaps the most important one: exclusive jurisdiction. And that is a legal mumbo-jumbo way of saying workers must give up the right to sue their employer in the courts of law in exchange for the no-fault system security of benefits that is employer funded and independently administered. So they called this the historic compromise. Workers gave up the right to sue their employers if they were injured in exchange for a workers' compensation system that was there for them in the event they were injured on the job. So it's important to remember that if you are injured while you are working here in Nova Scotia, you don't get to file a lawsuit for any injuries against your employer. Instead, you must go through the workers' compensation system here in Nova Scotia because they have exclusive jurisdiction. So those are the Meredith principles. They were developed over 120 years ago, and they form the basis of the workers' compensation system that we have today in Nova Scotia. They are important to remember because they sort of explain why things work the way they do. Now, since this Meredith Commission, since this Sir William Meredith came back with his 5 principles of what would be a good workers' compensation scheme, every single province and territory in Canada has developed their own workers' compensation system based on Meredith's principles. So whether you're working here in Nova Scotia or in Ontario or the Northwest Territories or British Columbia, every single jurisdiction has their own piece of legislation or their own law about what happens if an injured worker or if a worker is injured or killed on the job. We won't get into details here, but what you do need to know is that this is the law here in Canada, and Nova Scotia has its very own Workers' Compensation Act, its own law about workers' compensation, and that law, the Workers' Compensation Act, is administered by the organization called the Workers' Compensation Board, or the WCB, and that's why you will hear it referred to as WCB. So what does that mean for you? As a migrant worker, many of you who are here through the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. I gather some of you are not here through that program, but whether you are here through the SAWP or through another route of migrant working, all employers must arrange coverage under the workers' compensation system in the province where you're working. There are some very rare circumstances where the employer in other provinces might be allowed to get you different coverage, but if you're here in Nova Scotia and in most other provinces in Canada, your employer is legally obligated to ensure that you are covered under the workers' compensation system here in this province. So it is mandatory that this coverage be provided, that you have the protections under the workers' compensation law here in Nova Scotia. It's mandatory that the employer provide that coverage at no cost to you. They are not allowed to charge you any amount for the coverage that they're providing under the workers' compensation system. The employer does have to pay, but workers never have to pay for this, although sometimes employers try to get people to. And this coverage is in effect the moment you start working in Canada. There is no waiting time. So it takes effect from the moment you start work here. If you are injured while you are working here in Canada, this coverage under the workers' compensation system means that you have the right to be compensated for things like lost wages. So if you lose earnings or income, or you need to take time off work because you've been injured, you have the right to be compensated for lost wages. You have the right, if you've been injured, to necessary medical treatment. So the workers' compensation system will pay for any medical treatment that you need, and we'll talk a bit more about those things in detail. Again, it's a no-fault system. It does not matter if the injury was your fault, if you were careless and something happened, or if you broke a rule and you ended up being injured. It doesn't matter. You are still covered under the workers' compensation system. It doesn't matter if it was a coworker's fault. It doesn't matter if it was anyone's fault. If you were injured in the workplace, you are covered by the workers' compensation system. You do not have to go to court. You do not have to file lawsuits. All you need to do is file a claim for workers' compensation. And that's a pretty straightforward process. We'll go into in a little bit more detail about how to do that. But WCB will then decide whether or not your claim is accepted, and if so, what benefits they will cover. So now that we've talked a bit about the history and the structure of the workers' compensation system here, now that you know that workers' compensation, or WCB, is how injured workers receive compensation for their injuries, and now that you know that you also have that coverage from the moment you start any kind of work here in Nova Scotia, we're going to talk about the Workers' Compensation Board claims and the kinds of benefits that the workers' compensation system provides. In order to receive any kind of workers' compensation, obviously you need to file a claim, and your claim needs to be accepted. So we'll talk about how to go about reporting and applying for a workers' compensation claim. That means step one is filing a claim in the first place. The first thing, if you believe you've been injured at work, that you need to do, step one, is reporting your injury and applying or filing a WCB claim. Then we'll talk about step two. Now that your claim has been filed, WCB will assign someone to look at your claim and decide whether or not your claim is going to be accepted. They don't accept everything, and they don't just take your word for what happened. There is some need to provide evidence, and there are some requirements in order to get your claim accepted, but we'll talk about that. Now, once a claim is accepted by workers' compensation, there's a third step, and the third step is WCB will decide what kind of benefits they're going to pay. And just because your claim has been accepted doesn't mean you're entitled to all different kinds of benefits or that those benefits will last forever. So we will talk about what kind of benefits they pay and how those benefits work. So let's first start with step one. If you are injured at work, what do you do? How do you report your injury? And how do you apply or file a claim at the Workers' Compensation Board? So obviously, the first step in any kind of workplace injury is to make sure that a claim is filed, is that WCB has been notified of the injury and has been given all of the information they need in order to make a decision on the claim. Now, the primary responsibility for letting WCB know that there's been an injury falls on your employer. Your employer is required to report the injury to WCB within 5 business days of becoming aware of the injury. So as soon as the employer knows that there's been an injury, they're legally required to let WCB know. There are some nuances to that. They must report injuries that result in lost time from work. So if someone's injured and they have to take a couple hours off, your employer must report that. And they must also report injuries that require medical care. So if you've been injured, and I mean, sometimes it happens, you have a relatively minor injury, maybe a small cut on your finger, you let your employer know and they give you a Band-Aid and back you go to work. The employer doesn't have to report that kind of thing to WCB because you didn't lose any time from work and you didn't have to see a doctor about it. But if there's an injury that does have time loss or medical aid, the employer is legally required to report that injury to the Workers' Compensation Board within 5 days. So that's the employer's job. And we'll talk a little more about what happens if the employer doesn't do their job. But what's your job as the injured worker? Now, what the law says is your responsibility if you've been injured at work is, number one, to tell your employer. So you do have to report your injury to your employer as soon as is practicable. So that doesn't always mean you have to report it immediately. Sometimes it may not be practicable to report it to your employer until a couple days has passed and you now know that this injury isn't going away. So you have to report it as soon as possible to your employer. That doesn't always mean right away, immediately. We often see people who report their injuries to their employers a week or 2 weeks after the injury has happened. And there can be lots of reasons why people might do that. That's okay. You should get your injury reported to your employer as soon as possible, but it's never too late to let your employer know about an injury. But that's your first responsibility. You do have to report it to your employer. Your second responsibility is to file an application with WCB within 12 months. Your employer is supposed to help you with that process. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But you do have to make sure that WCB is notified. Now, we know that your employer is supposed to have already reported the injury to WCB because the law says that's their job. But even if they don't, you as an injured worker have a responsibility to file an application with WCB within 12 months. So don't always count on your employer to report the injury. You do have to do it yourself as well. Keep in mind that it is supposed to be reported to WCB. So you are supposed to apply to WCB within 12 months. But claims can be considered up to 5 years after the injury, depending on the circumstances. And we do see situations in which someone suffered an injury 4 years ago and for whatever reason didn't report it to WCB, and they decide to report it later, and those injuries can be accepted by WCB. That's not ideal. It's far better to file your claim immediately, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and it's never too late to file a claim. So we would always tell you, even if you didn't report it to your employer immediately, even if you didn't get an application to WCB within 12 months, you should still file your claim and let WCB figure out what to do with it. So that's reporting and applying. Here's a quick graphic on when and how to file a WCB claim. This presentation is going to remain on Facebook, I know, and I think it will also be on YouTube, or the other way around. Anyway, it's definitely on YouTube, I know that. So if you want to come back someday and check it out, if you forget any of this information, you can always come back and see it again. This graphic can be really helpful for people because it talks about when and how to file a claim, and it's just a good quick reference. So when are you supposed to file a WCB claim? You're supposed to file a WCB claim when you have been, or you believe you may have been, injured at work. And when that injury results in either lost time from work or requires medical care. So that's when you are supposed to notify your employer and WCB that an injury has occurred. What's important to note here is that it doesn't say that you should file a claim when you know that you've been injured at work. It says you should file it if you believe you may have been injured at work. Okay? And that's important because when we are thinking about workplace injuries, we're often thinking about obvious things like sudden lacerations or broken bones, or accidents like car accidents that cause injuries. But there are injuries that sometimes you're not sure where it came from. Maybe you have started to get a sore back. Nothing really happened at work, but somehow your back has just started to get really sore. And you're not sure why that's happening. Maybe it's because of something you did yesterday at work. Maybe it's not. But you don't need to be sure. You just need to think it's possible that work caused this problem. Another one we'll often see is people who start to develop breathing problems and they're not sure why. And they think maybe it's something in the workplace. Maybe they have an allergy to something, or maybe they've been exposed to a chemical and these breathing problems are an issue. In those cases, you would file a claim, even if you are not certain, because it is WCB's job to make the decision on whether or not that injury was caused by work. And they will do that. So when to file a claim, you're going to file it if you have been or you believe you may have been injured at work. Now, how do you file a claim? Again, you should report your injury to your employer as soon as possible. And what's important is that that injury be reported before you quit your job. And that is required by law. So don't quit your job and then report your injury. And the way to file a claim is to complete a form called a Notice of Injury form and to send it to WCB within 12 months. Honestly, the form itself isn't really that important. What is important is that you notify WCB. You've got to tell your employer, but again, you also have to tell WCB that you've been injured. And there is a form available, but the form itself isn't mandatory. Now, at the end of the slideshow, I'm going to give you some information about how to contact my office. And if you need help filing a claim or figuring out how to go about it, that's what I do. I'll give you help with that, or my coworkers here can help you with that. That's our job. So we know when to file a claim. We have some idea of how to file a claim, or at least we know who to call if we think we've got to file a claim. What's important to remember is that if you are ever in doubt, you should file a claim for WCB. So you may not be 100% sure that your injury was caused by work. You may not be sure that WCB is going to cover your injury. But if there is any question at all about whether or not an injury was caused by work, you should always file a claim with WCB. If in doubt, file a claim. And we're going to go back to that several times because it is the one thing I do want you to remember. If in doubt, file a claim with WCB. And then if you have any issues or questions or problems, remember my name and my organization and how to find me. If that's all you remember, that's the most important stuff out of this presentation. In any event, that's the first step of the process, is making sure that your employer and the Workers' Compensation Board is aware that there's been an injury or that you believe you've been injured. And that's the reporting and applying process at WCB. Now, what if your employer refuses to file a claim? What if your employer says, you know what, I don't think you were injured at work, or no, WCB won't cover that anyway, so forget about it. This can happen quite often, actually. Your employer might not want you to file a WCB claim. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. They might want to hide your injury. So they may not want anyone to know that you've been injured at work. And in that case, they would prefer you not to notify the Workers' Compensation Board. Your employer might believe that your injury isn't going to be covered by WCB. Sometimes your employer might think you're lying or making up an injury. We do see that sometimes. Other times, your employer just doesn't understand workers' compensation and they have no idea how it works. And they really say or discourage you from filing a claim because they're not familiar with this whole system. Sometimes your employer will say to you, hey, don't worry about it. You've been injured, you can't work, we'll get you a ticket home. You can go home and recover there. That happens quite often. And employers will act like they're doing you a favor by offering to send you home so that you can recover. Your employer might also offer just to keep paying you. Look, take a day off. Don't worry, I won't cut your wages. We don't need to report to WCB. You just go get the rest you need. Let's not get anyone else involved. So your employer can offer to do that. Those things are illegal. They are against the law. Your employer is legally obligated to have WCB coverage for you, and they are legally obligated to report any injury to workers' compensation. It doesn't matter if they think that the injury is valid or not. They have to report it, and WCB will decide if it's valid. If your employer refuses to report to WCB, you can do that yourself. You can call workers' compensation yourself. You can contact my office. And again, my phone number will be at the end, or my contact information will be at the end. Or your doctor is often a really great resource because physicians here in Nova Scotia can initiate WCB claims. So your doctor can take care of that for you as well. But of course, first you have to get in to see a doctor. And we'll talk a bit about that as well. If your employer is reluctant to or is refusing to file a WCB claim, please contact someone, contact our office. Sometimes, like I said, it's not because they're nasty, it's just because they don't know what they're doing or they don't understand the system. But in many cases, they're trying to hide your injury, and they are trying to make things difficult for you. So it is not up to your employer whether or not a claim is filed. They must file the claim, and it's illegal for them to refuse to do so or to give you a hard time. So call someone if they refuse to file a claim. In any event, let's say your claim is filed now. Either, you've contacted our office and we've assisted in filing a claim, or perhaps you've, your employer has been cooperative and they've gone ahead and filed a claim. Now WCB has your claim, and now we need to figure out what WCB is going to do with it. WCB does not accept every single claim. They are going to do an investigation, and they're going to look at something called the FourPart Test. The FourPart Test says they will cover claims if there is a worker and that worker has a personal injury by accident, and that injury arises out of and in the course of employment. So that's the four-part test, and we'll break down the test just really quickly so that you know what WCB is looking at when they're deciding whether or not to accept a claim. First of all, you have to be a worker. In most provinces, workers are all covered by WCB, but there are some legal nuances. So there may be cases where someone's been injured and they're not a worker. All you need to know, however, is if you are here through the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program or some other temporary migrant worker programs here in Canada, your employer is required to have coverage, and therefore you would be considered, in almost all cases, a worker for the purposes of workers' compensation. Here in Nova Scotia, absolutely, your employer must have you covered by the workers' compensation system, and you would be considered a worker. So we can discard that part of the four-part test. We know that you've passed that part of the test. You are a worker. Remember, it is mandatory that the coverage is provided, that the employer provides it at no cost to you, and you should know that it takes effect the first day you get here in Canada. So now we know you're a worker. The next question is, do you have a personal injury by accident? A personal injury is a medical condition. It can be either a physical condition or, in some circumstances, a psychological condition. That injury should be diagnosed by a medical professional, and that could be a doctor, a physiotherapist, a chiropractor, a nurse. WCB does need, however, some medical evidence that you've suffered an injury. There are all different kinds of injuries that WCB accepts, and often they will cover injuries that you and your employer had no idea they would cover. So some examples of things WCB does cover. They cover the classics, the sudden injuries, the fractures, the cuts, the sudden strains of your back. But they also cover gradual injuries or injuries that occur over a period of time. Like I said, you might be doing very repetitive work, and after a couple weeks, your shoulder starts to get sore, and there's really been no accident, nothing sudden or unexpected happened. It's just the kind of work you've been doing repetitively. That's called a gradual injury, and WCB considers those to be injuries caused by accident. So absolutely, that kind of injury should be reported to WCB. Recurring injuries. So maybe some of you had an injury a couple of years ago, and you had a quick period of time where WCB provided assistance. if that injury recurs in the future, you can go back to WCB and they will again provide benefits. So WCB covers recurring injuries. Aggravations. So perhaps when you were a young person, you broke your leg. And now that you're at work and you're on your feet all of the time, that leg is starting to get really, really sore again. Now, you've got an old fracture that happened when you were a kid and it wasn't caused by work. But WCB will cover the aggravation of an old injury. So that is another thing that they will cover. WCB in certain situations will cover psychological injuries. So in cases where something traumatic happens in the workplace and you become psychologically injured as a result, WCB does cover those. Remember, not all injuries are obvious. You don't need to know for sure whether or not something was caused by work. You just need to think it might be, and that's when you should file a claim. So we know you're a worker, and let's say we now know that you've had some kind of personal injury by accident. The next thing WCB is going to look at when they're considering your claim is whether or not your injury arose out of employment and in the course of employment. So arising out of employment just means that the injury must be caused by something in the workplace. Arising in the course of employment generally means that your injury must happen while you're working. It's essentially establishing that your injury was caused by work. One example of a situation where an injury isn't arising out of employment might be a worker who has epilepsy or a seizure disorder, and they've had that disorder since they were a kid. One day while they're at work, they have a seizure for no reason at all. Now again, they've had this seizure disorder since they were a child. There wasn't anything really in the work that caused the seizure. It just happened for no reason. That seizure wouldn't be covered by WCB, even though it happened while that person was at work. And that's because the seizure didn't arise out of employment. It wasn't caused by work. It did happen at work, but it wasn't caused by work. So that's the kind of situation where WCB may say, this didn't arise out of employment, so we're not going to accept that. Now we'll talk about in the course of employment. And essentially, an injury has to occur in the course of employment, which just means that it has to happen while you're working. And that's pretty different for someone who is in the seasonal agricultural worker program or who's a migrant worker, because you will be covered in many cases where others are not usually covered. So in your case as a seasonal agricultural worker, you are covered by workers' compensation anytime you are on the employer's premises. And that includes the housing that they provide, even if it's after hours. You are also covered on your way to and from work. That would be considered something that's in the course of your employment because you're away from home and you are under sort of the supervision of your employer almost all the time, and you are using employer-provided premises. So anytime you're on the employer's premises and you've had an injury, even if you're not working at the time, you're just doing your own personal laundry, that may be considered work-related. On your way to and from work, in most cases, for those of us who commute to work, that's not something WCB covers, but in your case, they will cover it because the travel to and from work is generally provided by your employer, and because you're away from home. In some cases, even when you're in the community running errands, WCB may cover you. That is a little bit different, but you know, if your employer has brought you to the grocery store and you're injured in that case, even though you're buying food for yourself, that's something that would be considered work-related. One exception might be, if you and a few of your friends decide that you're going to go out to a pub one evening and have a few drinks, and while you're at the pub, you slip and fall there, it's possible that they may not consider that work-related. They may say you weren't in the course of employment. But in general, as a migrant worker, you are covered in almost all circumstances just by virtue of the fact that you're away from home, and for the most part under the control of your employer. So keep in mind, for seasonal agricultural workers, you're covered in many cases where WCB often does not cover other people. So we've talked about this four-part test. We know that you're a worker under the law. We're going to say that you did have a personal injury by accident and that that injury arose out of and in the course of employment. So in that case, you've met this four-part test and WCB will accept your claim. So what happens next? What does that even mean? You now have an accepted claim for workers' compensation. What happens? This is where we get to the third step. Now that your claim has been accepted, WCB is going to consider what benefits you're entitled to. And it's important to remember that just because a claim is accepted doesn't mean you're going to receive all of the benefits that WCB has available. So we'll talk a little bit about the benefits that WCB has. The 5 kinds of benefits that injured workers may be entitled to include earnings replacement benefits, medical aid benefits, permanent impairment benefits, and there are also vocational rehabilitation benefits and survivor benefits. Voc Rehab, or vocational rehabilitation, and survivor benefits, we're not going to get into in a great deal of detail. VR, or Voc Rehab, is retraining if someone can't return to work at their job they were doing, and survivor benefits are available to family members in the event a worker is killed on the job. So we won't go into those things. Instead, we'll focus today on earnings replacement, medical aid, and permanent impairment benefits. Earnings replacement benefits at WCB are paid when a loss of earnings results from an injury. If, because of your injury, you have to take time off of work and you lose earnings, then WCB will provide earnings replacement benefits. They will set a wage rate that is based on your income, and it should be based on your income from all sources. So perhaps you're here in Canada for 8 months, but the other 4 months of the year you do work in your home country. WCB does need to take your income from your work from all sources, whether it's here in Canada or back at home, and they use that to figure out how much money they need to give you. So they will pay you a portion of your lost wages, not all of it, but a portion of your lost wages, and they will continue to do that until you can either return to work or until you turn 65. So that is what WCB is supposed to pay you. One thing you should know as a migrant worker or as someone who doesn't live year-round here in Canada is that WCB benefits are paid in Canadian dollars only, and those benefits are paid by direct deposit or by check. Direct deposit can only be provided through a Canadian bank. They can't direct deposit to any other nationalities' banks. And they will issue checks, but only in Canadian dollars. So for the most part, what we find is people, migrant workers, find it easier if they do have a Canadian bank account. that they can access even when they're at home. Because, yeah, these benefits can continue for as long as you are unable to work because of your injury. And that includes even when your contract here in Canada ends and you're scheduled to go home. So that's something that's important to remember. So those are the earnings replacement benefits. WCB can also cover medical aid benefits, and they will cover medical aid that they consider necessary or expedient as the result of an injury. That can include prescription medications, physiotherapy, physician's bills, surgical fees, hospital rooms, and all of those things. They are required to cover medical aid if the treatment is being provided in your home country. So they'll take care of things while you're here in Canada, and that tends to be pretty straightforward because the billing process is all pretty easy. But they can also cover treatment that you need when you go home. And sometimes it can be a little difficult because often they'll ask you to pay for it up front and then submit your receipt and they'll pay you back. But just remember, WCB will pay for it no matter where you are. This medical aid coverage does not end. As long as you need treatment for your injury, whether it's tomorrow, 5 years from now, or 50 years in the future, WCB has to cover that treatment. Permanent impairment benefits are where you've been left with an injury that doesn't resolve and you've been left with a permanent injury. This is the kind of benefit that people hear about because it's often paid as a lump sum or a payout. So this is only available when an injury does become permanent, and it's kind of complicated, and hopefully we'll never have to deal with this. But in the event you do have a permanent injury, there are benefits for that as well. It's really important to realize and remember that this is why it is important to file a claim with WCB. Your employer might offer to just keep paying you, even if you're unable to work, but I doubt very much your employer is going to cover your medical bills or some kind of permanent impairment benefit. So it is very important to make sure that you do apply for workers' compensation and notify them that you've been injured and you want to file a claim. We're going to not talk about vocational rehabilitation because I'm already taking too long, but Workers' Compensation Board is a legal system. So what I want you to know is when WCB makes a decision, either to accept your claim, they'll decide whether or not you're losing earnings because of your injury. They'll decide if they're going to pay earnings replacement or medical aid benefits. If they say no to you, you have a right to appeal that decision. And in order to appeal it, you have to get a written decision from WCB. If you get to this point, if ever you have a disagreement with someone at WCB, you should contact my office and I can help you with this process and sorting it out. Just remember, if WCB ever says no to you, if they say, no, I'm not accepting your claim, or no, I'm not going to pay that medical bill, then you have the right to appeal. And there are people who can help you with that, myself included. I think we'll skip through the section on the duties of the employer and the worker, because we have talked about them through the course of the last hour. Remember that you do have to file a claim and report it to your employer. One thing you will often find if you do have an accepted WCB claim is WCB will encourage an early return to work. So you may have an injury and your injury may not be fully resolved, but WCB will start to talk to you about returning to work. Sometimes that might look different than your usual job. So your employer might offer you something lighter to do. If WCB talks to you about that, then in general, it's good to cooperate with them as much as possible and as much as is reasonable. And if you've got questions, you can always call us. So I'm going to summarize really quickly some of the key points, things that I think you should remember. WCB stands for the Workers' Compensation Board. WCB is how workplace injuries are compensated for. In most Canadian provinces, Nova Scotia is one of them, migrant workers are covered by WCB if they are injured at work. WCB coverage starts the moment you start working in Canada. There's no waiting period. In many cases, migrant workers are covered even if they aren't actively working. That coverage for workplace injuries extends to your employer's premises, including housing or the transportation they're providing. So while you are here in Canada, at almost all times, you are covered by workers' compensation because essentially you are virtually always in the course of employment. Your employer is required by law to report your injury to WCB if you lose time from work or if you need medical attention. If your employer refuses, or if you aren't sure that your employer has reported your injury, then you should make sure it's been reported. You can contact WCB. You can talk to a doctor because, again, physicians have a pretty special relationship with WCB and they know how to get your claim filed. Or you can contact my organization. And in general, the best way to do that is, or one of the best ways is through Facebook. But I'll give you some more ways to do that in a minute. Remember, WCB covers many different kinds of injuries. WCB will pay for necessary medical care, whether it's here in Canada or in your home country, and they will cover it for as long as is necessary, whether that's 5 days, 5 years, or 50 years. Remember, you should always get WCB decisions in writing, and we'll help you with that. And remember, when in doubt, file a claim. If there are two things that I'd like you to leave this session with, it's when in doubt, file a claim. And if you've got questions or issues, contact Rachel at the Office of the Worker Counsellor. That's me. You can send us a message on Facebook at our site, Worker Counsellor. All you need to do is search us on Facebook. You can email me at info@workercounsellor.ca, or you can call at 1-877-220-2722. We are hoping to get set up for a WhatsApp contact stream. We haven't got that yet here at my organization, but at some point we're going to arrange to have that set up, and we'll make sure that that's posted on our Facebook page so y'all can see it. If for some reason you can't reach me, I know that you can always reach Stacy or reach out to Stacy at No One Is Illegal. And Stacy is always willing to put people in touch with us. Okay. So that concludes my presentation. That was a long one.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for. Just want to remind everyone, if you have questions for Rachel, you can send us a WhatsApp message. Tabassa, could you put up the number that people can call or send a message to? It's 902, 329-9595. Feel free to send us your questions for Rachel. We have a period where we are accepting your questions. So we received one question so far. Okay. What if a person is fired or sent home immediately after reporting an injury?
That actually does happen. It is illegal. And if that was to occur, then I would encourage the individual who's been sent home to reach out to Stacy or myself. You can still file a claim for workers' compensation from your home. It doesn't matter where you are. We can get the claim filed, and you can get medical attention, and WCB should cover it no matter where you are. As well, WCB can arrange to pay benefits, and we'll do everything within our power to make sure that you can access those benefits. The other thing we would do is try to make sure your employer's held accountable for having sent you home after you've reported an injury, because there are fines and penalties. So we would absolutely work with you to decide if that's something that you wanted to pursue. You know, if you wanted to go after the employer that way. So absolutely, if you are sent home immediately after an injury, you can still get in touch with us via Stacy and WhatsApp, or with the Office of the Worker Counsellor on Facebook. And absolutely, please, we can still get a claim filed, and we can still make sure you get compensation.
Thank you. And let's see. So there was a related question. How would WCB calculate time lost at work if the person wasn't off work in Canada? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I guess I'm not entirely clear on what you mean by if they're not off work in Canada. But I'm going to guess that maybe what you mean is, you've been sent home and you can't do your usual job that you would have at home. Ultimately, WCB would calculate time loss the same way that they would if you were here in Canada. They would figure out how much money you would have been earning if you hadn't been injured. That can require some work, getting paperwork together, but we can help with that too. Does that answer the question? Stacy, do you think that sort of covered it?
Yes, I think that's how I understood the question.
Yeah, it's important to know. Essentially, WCB is supposed to be making sure that you get the wages that you're losing because of your injury, and whether those wages would have been from a job here in Canada or those wages are from a job that you would have had at home. WCB is responsible to cover those lost wages.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And also just to add, we've provided support to a number of workers who have gone home and have been off of work and have been able to continue to receive benefits that usually started here and continue on as they're not able to work yet when they've returned home. Shared with the officer at WCB, and workers have been able to get those benefits. I know sometimes workers need help to navigate the system. I think it's important for people to know that is possible, that has happened previously.
And if I could add, it's really important not to listen to what your employer might tell you about that. Because often employers don't understand how WCB works. It's really important that you, and that's not just, even the best, kindest, most helpful employers often do not understand WCB and how it works. And they may tell you that, no, WCB doesn't cover you after you go home. Because they honestly don't think WCB does.
Mhm.
But just don't listen to anyone tell you what WCB will or won't do, except WCB. That's always the message. I know how WCB works, but I wouldn't accept what I tell you either, right? The people who make decisions about benefits and claims are the Workers' Compensation Board, and you shouldn't accept anyone else's opinion. Your employers, anyone's. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot, Rachel. And let's see, maybe a few things. So we continue to be open. Our line is open for your questions. If you have any additional questions for Rachel. And also maybe as we are waiting for questions to come through, there's a few things that come to mind for in terms of workers' compensation in relation to migrant workers. So I think one is it is possible to register online with WCB, so you can be in direct contact with your the officer if that's a route that you choose. And I know sometimes it can be hard to get through on the line to the your caseworker. So yeah, that's just something that to mention. But it is, there's kind of a unfortunately, you have to have a Nova Scotia health card to be able to register for WCB online. But also, you can call and ask for your Cohen insurance number to be put on file, and then use that to register for WCB. So yeah, that's something that we have been able to do that has helped workers to be in direct contact with the caseworker. But I think that it's one of the many ways, unfortunately, that sometimes there are barriers for workers in accessing WCB. And I think, yeah, you shouldn't have to have a health card to register online, but this is just something that we found that so far has been something that has worked.
That's good to hear, because the online portal for WCB can be so helpful if you don't have to, because otherwise the only way to reach your caseworker is by telephone. And that can be really challenging if you're not available through the days, or if you don't have a Canadian phone number. And using the portal online lets you send them messages back and forth, and it's really valuable resource. So I'm glad that they're trying to make it accessible. The other thing I'd like people to know is if you feel more comfortable speaking in a language other than English, WCB can provide interpreters, professional interpreters, and they often don't offer professional interpreters, but you can ask for one, and they can arrange one. Many people are, obviously, if you're English, it's not a problem, but if English isn't your first language, even if your English is really, really strong, dealing with the terminology at WCB can be quite challenging. So even if your English is really strong, if you are more comfortable in another language, you can absolutely request an interpreter, and WCB will provide one. Like I said, in my experience, they don't offer them, but absolutely you're entitled to one.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I think that's definitely really important. I know definitely that's a big challenge in a lot of other services in terms of workers being able to access different services around interpretation. So that's really great. And I also, maybe just practically, I think if it is, I would say, better if you can and want to make a workers' compensation claim before you leave, because just in terms of signing of papers, maybe if you want to get direct deposit to your Canadian bank account, kind of setting that up. For example, leaving some money in your bank account so it remains active if you want to continue to use it for receiving benefits, those kind of things. It's just practically, is good if those things can be done before. But as you say, we definitely people encourage people anyways, even if that didn't happen, to still file, if that makes sense for them.
Absolutely. And our organization can help. And again, it's not always easy to reach our organization either, but if email works, or if Facebook Messenger works, and at some point we will have WhatsApp, you can reach out to our organization, the Office of the Worker Counsellor, and we will do everything we can to help you establish your claim. And that's true whether you're here in Canada or back at home. We have interpreters as well that we can access if that makes things easier. And again, our services are 100% confidential. And we make sure you're in the driver's seat. So, what we do and how we do it is entirely up to you as the injured worker. So I just want to make sure, or I hope that, people would feel comfortable reaching out to us with questions or concerns. You can do so anonymously, absolutely, as well. We're here just to try to help.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Rachel. So I think that maybe we'll close it off there. And again, if anyone has any follow-up questions, we're happy to share that with Rachel, and get back to you with answers. And also, we encourage you to share this video with your coworkers and your friends, and it will remain recorded at the same link that you used to connect tonight. So thank you. Thanks so much, Rachel, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today.
Terrific. Thank you, Stacey. Thanks, Tabasa. And thank you, everyone.
Have a good night.
Bye.